Thank you, John. I was quite interested by the discussions of the panel. I thought it would be a good idea to make concluding remarks to hear what people would have to say before I talk. So, my first remark would probably be that divergences in the regulation of financial markets are quite not a recent phenomenon. I think those of you that are old enough may remember days where it was actually quite a lot more diverging than it is today. And before the financial crisis struck, lawmakers and regulators globally had been much less prone to consider, let alone work towards common regulatory standards and objectives that would be implementable back home. Not anymore. One of the most important lessons from the crisis has been the realization just how deeply interrelated financial markets are. I think Simon alluded to that point. And how much cross-border damage can be triggered by regulatory actions and failures in a single jurisdiction. So luckily today, in a way, divergences in the scope of financial regulation are not as fundamental as they used to be still some years ago. Now, of course, the degree of convergence is varying. In the Eurozone, we have achieved the banking union, so we are fully integrated, the rules, but also the supervision. Within the EU, we have what we call the single rule book, so at least we all obey to the same set of rules, even if some allow for more supervisory divergences than others. And at international level, also, a set of common principles, if not rules, have been developed quite forcefully by G20, which, for by and large, the single rule book implements in the European Union, or commitment to work with the FSB, G20, and other global standard setters has always been there. Actually, the EU has been invariably quite a good pupil in the class in that respect. We'll come back to that. Looking into the future, I think we can expect that this will continue. I don't think financial markets are going to shrink in geographical scope. So that means that if we want to have effective regulation and supervision, supervisors and regulators will have to link with each other increasingly. And that's a good point which one of you made. I can't remember who is the earlier we layers, of course, the better. And I'll come back to this when I offer a few comments on our negotiations with our American friends. What is important, of course, is that regulators and supervisors in each jurisdiction are more inclined to accept the ownership in the solution achieved in the international fora. It's better than it used to be, but we can still progress in that respect. Now, in Europe, we understand very well that financial regulation cannot be made in isolation. Our engagement with key international partners is there to achieve both stability and regulatory convergence in financial markets. And in that regard, we believe in the merits of bilateral dialogues between policymakers and regulators, as I said, as early as possible in their respective legislative processes. That may not always ensure an optimal solution. We, for example, engaged quite early with the United States when we were doing EMIR and they were doing Dodd-Frank. It remains still that parliamentarians in each jurisdiction have a tendency to believe that they have been elected by the people to make laws, and therefore they make laws as they see best fit in their jurisdiction. And they may therefore, on the basis of the same principle, reach different solutions. And then, depending on how different the solutions are, it is more or less difficult to then agree on what we call equivalence, what are they called, substituted compliance or difference. A word was said about TTIP. Well, of course, there is a prudential carve-out in GATS. That is clear. probably nobody is willing to abolish that, not even the EU. It remains that when it comes in particular to our cooperation with America, with the United States, we together represent 80% of all financial transactions in the world. And therefore, I think there is a crucial, vital importance that we cooperate effectively. Because a lot depends on how effectively we cooperate. Both sides, actually. If we are ineffective in the sense that we are overlapping on inconsistent requirements, we hamper the business. And if we are inconsistent in the sense that we leave wide gaps in between what we both regulate, then we may have the coming back of behavior that we don't want to see returning. So I think we have an imperative to cooperate and cooperate to the full extent. For this, I think, and the Commission thinks, that there is a case for having a more structured and more binding mechanism, and whether it's encoded in TTIP or it's encoded into other forms of binding international agreement, something we can discuss, but TTIP is certainly a good enough vehicle for this. And I think at the heart of the divergence of view we have with the US is the fact that they see, and this is very relevant to the topic of today, they see market access as something that is distinct and not necessarily linked to regulatory convergence. And we see market access as something that is completely linked to regulatory convergence. In other words, we are not willing, and actually given the way our laws are drafted, we are not able to give market access to players from jurisdiction that are subjected to substantially lower standards than our standards in Europe. This is the way the Parliament drafted the legislation in Europe. And this is actually the basis on which we can or cannot grant equivalence. That is, for example, very clear in EMEA. One can dispute this starting point, but that is the point. Now, there is no discussion that the American legislation in the field and practice, the fields of derivatives, is solid, robust, etc. Still, we actually, I think it's public knowledge, we're stuck on one thing, which are the difference in margining. For the difference in margining, of course, you have a number of issues, including issues of competitive playing field that are at stake and must be resolved. We're working very hard with our American friends to resolve them, and I'm convinced we will. Because we should remain realistic. I mean, I want someone of you question the issue of outcome-based equivalence. What is outcome-based equivalence? Well, this is simply a very simple thing in the end of the day. This is that the European Union does not request foreign jurisdiction to have the same legislation as it has. It simply requests that they have a legislation that reaches broadly the same effect. In other words, what we are concerned about or attentive to is the amount of risk that we import or may import when we grant access to players that are registered and supervised in a foreign jurisdiction. And this is what guides our assessment. Because we have to be realistic. A number of divergences come from legal tradition, market structures, societal expectation, and they cannot and should not be dismissed or lifted too easily. We have no problem with this. Actually, this leads me to a side remark based on what Judith said. CMU without frontier remind me Peter Gabriel. So growth without fear, I would say. CMU without frontier, and you took the comparison with the US, which is, okay, it's a nice way to put things in perspective. On the other hand, our aim is not and should not be to mimic the US, because there are a number of reasons why the US have the capital markets they have. And one of the key reasons for this is that it is very closely linked and related to the way they finance the social model. And my impression is that European citizens are not prepared to move to the American way of financing the social model, certainly not in continental Europe. So, in other words, if this would be the way we would sell the capital market union, I think the project would be dead before having even started. This being said, there is a lot of margin for improvement in the size and performance of capital markets in Europe before you hit that issue of compliance with the social model and the way you finance it. And this is this margin that we are willing to exploit.